Bang! The judge's gavel struck the wooden block with a force that sent a sharp echo through the courtroom. The murmurs of the audience fell silent, all eyes turning to the man at the defendant's table. Jason Whitmore, the arrogant, smirking son of billionaire real estate mogul Charles Whitmore. Dressed in an expensive tailored suit, Jason leaned back in his chair, arms folded, exuding an air of untouchable confidence. He had done this before, walked into a courtroom, shrugged off the charges, and walked out with nothing more than a slap on the wrist. His father's money and influence had always paved the way for his freedom, but today felt different. Judge Eleanor Monroe sat on the bench, her piercing blue eyes locked on Jason like a predator studying its prey. Unlike the judges he had faced before, the ones who caved under pressure, the ones who whispered into their recorders with weary compliance, Judge Monroe was an entirely different beast. She adjusted her glasses, her expression unreadable. "Mr. Whitmore," she said, her voice even but firm, "you stand accused of reckless endangerment, destruction of property, and leaving the scene of an accident. You were caught on camera driving a luxury sports car at over 120 miles per hour through a residential neighborhood. Do you have any idea how many lives you put at risk?" Jason smirked. "With all due respect, Your Honor, nobody got hurt. Just a few scratches on some parked cars. And let's be honest, those people could use the insurance money." A stunned silence filled the courtroom. Even his own lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Judge Monroe's jaw tightened. She had seen her fair share of entitled defendants, but Jason was in a league of his own. She tapped her gavel lightly, her voice turning cold. "Let me be very clear, Mr. Whitmore. This is not a country club dispute, nor a business transaction your father can smooth over. This is a court of law, and in my courtroom, justice is not for sale." Jason chuckled under his breath. "That's cute," he muttered. Judge Monroe's eyes narrowed. She wasn't just going to deliver a verdict. She was about to teach this spoiled billionaire's son a lesson he would never forget. A hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom at Judge Monroe's words. Jason Whitmore, however, remained unfazed. He had heard variations of this speech before, judges pretending they wouldn't bend, only to crumble when his father's influence came into play. Leaning forward with an amused smirk, Jason shrugged. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't think we need to waste everyone's time here. My legal team has already prepared a generous settlement for the damages. I'm sure we can all move on." Judge Monroe didn't blink. "Oh, you think this is about money, Mr. Whitmore?" Jason's lawyer, an older man named Thomas Reed, cleared his throat. "Your Honor, my client is fully willing to compensate the victims, and I don't recall asking for your input, Mr. Reed." Judge Monroe cut him off, her eyes locked on Jason. She leaned forward slightly, voice like steel. "Tell me, Mr. Whitmore, how many times have you stood in a courtroom like this, expecting to buy your way out?" Jason's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "You have a record," the judge continued, flipping through a file. "Multiple reckless driving offenses, disorderly conduct, property damage. Yet, each time, the charges mysteriously disappear." She snapped the file shut. "Until now." Jason's jaw clenched. "With all due respect, Your Honor, stop saying 'with all due respect' when you clearly have none." Judge Monroe interrupted sharply. "You put lives in danger, Mr. Whitmore. A mother and her child had to jump out of the way when you sped through that neighborhood. Had you been 1 second slower on that turn, we wouldn't be discussing reckless endangerment. We'd be discussing manslaughter." For the first time, Jason looked slightly uncomfortable. He stole a glance at his father, Charles Whitmore, who sat in the front row with a carefully controlled expression. The billionaire's usual confidence was present, but there was something else, a flicker of unease. Judge Monroe turned to the prosecution. "What's the proposed sentencing?" The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed woman in her late 30s, adjusted her glasses. "Given Mr. Whitmore's history and the severity of the charges, we're seeking the maximum penalty, 2 years in prison." A collective gasp rippled through the room. Jason's smirk vanished. "Excuse me?" he blurted out. 2 years? For a few scratched cars? "This isn't about the cars, Mr. Whitmore," Judge Monroe said icily. "This is about your repeated disregard for the law, about the lives you endangered." and about the fact that, for once, you're not going to walk away without consequences. Jason shot a glare at his father. Charles Whitmore leaned back, his fingers interlocked, expression unreadable. This wasn't going the way Jason had planned. For the first time in his life, Jason Whitmore was in real trouble. A tense silence hung in the air. Jason's face turned a shade paler as he processed what had just been said. 2 years in prison? That was impossible. This was supposed to be another slap on the wrist, another case of a fine and an apology. His father, Charles Whitmore, finally stood up, adjusting the cuffs of his designer suit. His presence alone was enough to command attention. When he spoke, his voice was smooth and calculated. "Your Honor, if I may have a word?" Judge Monroe regarded him with a cold expression. "Mr. Whitmore, unless you're the defense counsel, I suggest you remain seated." Charles gave a polite smile, but there was steel behind it. "I only wish to remind the court that my son has no prior convictions. I trust we can reach a more reasonable resolution." Judge Monroe leaned forward. "Are you suggesting that justice should be tailored to accommodate wealth, Mr. Whitmore?" "I'm suggesting that dragging this out serves no one," Charles replied smoothly. "A young man's future should not be ruined over a misunderstanding. Jason has learned his lesson. We are prepared to make a sizable donation to the city's road safety programs. This isn't a negotiation." Judge Monroe cut him off sharply. "Your son isn't here because of a misunderstanding. He's here because of his own reckless choices." She turned back to Jason. "Do you even feel remorse for what you did? Or are you just upset that, for once, you're facing real consequences?" Jason opened his mouth, but no words came out. Charles took a step forward. "Your Honor, we both know how these things work." His voice dropped slightly, just enough for only those closest to hear. "There are ways to resolve this outside of court. Surely, we can come to a mutual understanding." The courtroom tensed. It was an unspoken truth that money had a way of making problems disappear. Charles Whitmore wasn't making a request. He was making an offer. Judge Monroe's gaze darkened. "Are you attempting to bribe this court, Mr. Whitmore?" Charles chuckled, shaking his head. "Of course not. I'm simply stating that there are better ways to handle these matters. If you're worried about optics, we can make the donation anonymously." A slow, knowing smile crossed Judge Monroe's face. She leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together. "You know, Mr. Whitmore, I've had many cases in my courtroom where privilege tried to tip the scales of justice. And I've seen people like you walk away without ever feeling the weight of their actions. But today," she turned to Jason, "today, things are going to be different." Jason shifted uncomfortably. His confidence was slipping. Judge Monroe lifted her gavel. "The court will now take a recess. When we return, I will deliver my ruling." She struck the gavel down. Jason stormed out of the courtroom, his fists clenched as he pushed through the heavy wooden doors. His father followed close behind, his usual air of control barely masking the irritation simmering beneath his calm facade. "This is ridiculous," Jason muttered, pacing in the hallway. 2 years in prison? Dad, do something." Charles exhaled, his jaw tightening. "I'm handling it." Jason's lawyer, Thomas Reed, walked up, a forced smile on his face. "We may still have a way out of this, Mr. Whitmore," he said, lowering his voice. "Judge Monroe has a reputation for being tough, but everyone has a price." Charles shot him a sharp look. "You think I haven't already considered that?" Thomas hesitated before continuing. "I've also looked into her background. She wasn't born into money. She worked her way up. She's the type who prides herself on integrity. We might need a different approach." Jason scoffed. "So what? We appeal to her sense of fairness? Because that's obviously working out great for me." Before Charles could respond, a voice interrupted them. "You people really don't get it, do you?" Jason turned to see an older man standing nearby, leaning on a cane. He was one of the victims from the reckless driving incident, the father of the young mother who had nearly been hit. His weathered face was set with quiet anger. "You think your money can make this go away?" the man said, shaking his head. "But there are some things money can't fix, like my granddaughter's nightmares. Like the fear my daughter feels every time she steps outside, wondering if the next rich kid speeding down the road will be the last thing she sees." Jason rolled his eyes. "Look, I didn't actually hit anyone. No, the man cut him off. But you could have. And the fact that you don't see the problem is exactly why you deserve whatever's coming to you. Jason clenched his jaw, looking away. Charles, however, met the man's gaze without a flicker of emotion. I respect your feelings, Charles said smoothly. But my son is not a criminal. The man scoffed. No, he's just never had to pay for his crimes. The words stung more than Jason wanted to admit. He had never thought of himself as a bad person, just someone who lived life on his own terms. But now, for the first time, he was beginning to feel something unfamiliar. Doubt. Before he could process it, the bailiff's voice called through the hallway. Court is back in session. Jason swallowed hard. The moment of truth had arrived. Jason walked back into the courtroom, his heart pounding in a way he had never experienced before. The confidence he had when this all started was gone. The reality of the situation was sinking in. Judge Monroe entered and took her seat, her expression unreadable. The courtroom quieted as she looked over her notes one final time before turning her attention to Jason. This court has reviewed all evidence, witness testimonies, and the defendant's prior history. Mr. Whitmore, you have shown no remorse, no accountability, and a blatant disregard for the safety of others. Jason swallowed hard. Your father has attempted to use his wealth to influence the outcome of this case, she continued, her tone sharp. But justice is not for sale in my courtroom. Charles's jaw tightened. Now, before I deliver my ruling, I want to ask you something, Jason. She leaned forward slightly. Do you believe you should face consequences for your actions? Jason hesitated. He could feel his father's stare burning into him, waiting for him to say the right thing. His voice faltered. This was his last chance, his final moment to prove that he wasn't just some spoiled rich kid who thought he was above the law. But admitting guilt meant acknowledging that he had done something wrong, something that couldn't be erased with money. He clenched his fists. I never meant to hurt anyone. Judge Monroe nodded. That's not what I asked. Jason hesitated again, then took a deep breath. Yes, I should be held accountable. A stunned silence fell over the courtroom. Even Charles looked momentarily taken aback. Judge Monroe studied Jason for a long moment, as if weighing the sincerity in his words. Then she straightened. Jason Whitmore, I hereby sentence you to... She paused, letting the tension build. 1 year of mandatory community service, including working at a rehabilitation center for victims of reckless driving. Additionally, you will pay full restitution to the victims of this case. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Jason's eyes widened. 1 year of community service? He had expected the worst, a prison sentence. But this was something different. Charles immediately stood. Your Honor, that is highly unusual. Judge Monroe held up a hand. Sit down, Mr. Whitmore. If your son had shown no remorse, I would have sentenced him to prison. But for the first time, he took responsibility. Her gaze shifted to Jason. Now, let's see if you truly mean it. Jason nodded, his throat dry. The gavel slammed down. Court is adjourned. As Jason walked out of the courtroom, he felt a strange mix of relief and uncertainty. A year of community service? It wasn't prison, but it was a punishment far more humbling than anything he'd imagined. Charles Whitmore, still clad in his expensive suit, stormed out beside him. This is an outrage. You should have been given a fine or at most house arrest. His voice was sharp, his frustration palpable. Jason didn't respond immediately. His mind was reeling. You should have fought harder, Charles continued, his voice low but intense. This was a mistake. Do you realize what this means for the Whitmore name? Jason's stomach tightened. I know, Dad, but I think this might actually be a good thing. Charles shot him a baffled look. A good thing? Are you out of your mind? You've just been humiliated in front of everyone. Jason sighed, running a hand through his hair. I know, but maybe I needed this. Maybe it's time I start taking responsibility for the things I've done, instead of just running away from them. His father's eyes narrowed. What's that supposed to mean? It means I'm going to do this, Jason replied, his voice firm. I'm going to serve my community. I'm going to make things right. Charles's jaw clenched. You'll regret this, Jason. You'll regret letting them push you around like this. Jason shook his head, refusing to back down. I'm doing this for me, not for you. not for anyone else. He turned to walk away, but Charles grabbed his arm. You think you can fix this with a year of community service? This isn't going to change anything. The press will eat you alive. They'll call you a failure. Jason glanced back at his father, the weight of the situation settling heavily on his shoulders. Maybe I deserve to be called a failure. His father looked as if he'd been slapped. Jason pulled his arm from Charles's grip and continued walking, leaving his father standing there, his mouth agape. As Jason stepped out into the bright sunlight, a strange sense of freedom washed over him. He wasn't sure what the next year would bring or how he would feel about his punishment, but for the first time, he felt like he was facing the world on his own terms. Later that week, Jason began his community service at a local rehabilitation center for victims of reckless driving. It was nothing like the luxurious life he was used to. The first day was the hardest. He worked alongside people who had lost loved ones to accidents, people who were angry, hurt, and desperate for answers. Jason had nothing to offer except his time. But the more he listened, the more he realized how much he had been hiding from the world. One day, while cleaning the center's parking lot, he overheard a conversation between two of the victims. Do you think he gets it? One of them asked. The rich kid? The other woman scoffed. He'll never understand. He thinks he's above it all. Jason felt a pang in his chest. They were right. He had been that person. The arrogant, entitled son of a billionaire who never thought twice about his actions. But in that moment, he made a silent vow to change. He didn't know how long it would take, but Jason was determined to find a way to truly make amends. Jason's days at the rehabilitation center were long and grueling. He wasn't assigned any special treatment, no shortcuts, no privileges. Instead, he was given the same tasks as everyone else: mopping floors, cleaning toilets, assisting patients with their therapy. At first, the work felt degrading. He had spent his entire life avoiding discomfort, and now he was living in it. He quickly realized that no one there cared about his last name or his wealth. To them, he was just another worker. And that was the most humbling part of all. One afternoon, Jason was assigned to help a man named Luis with his therapy exercises. Luis was in his late 40s, a father of 3, and had been confined to a wheelchair after a reckless driver hit his motorcycle. Jason swallowed hard when he saw Luis struggling to lift a small dumbbell with his injured arm. The man's face was etched with frustration, his muscles trembling with the effort. Need a hand? Jason asked hesitantly. Luis looked up at him, his gaze sharp. What I need is to be able to hold my daughter again without help, he said bitterly. Jason nodded slowly, unsure of what to say. He realized that no amount of money could fix what Luis had lost. Instead of responding, he simply pulled up a chair and sat beside him. Minutes passed in silence before Luis finally spoke again. You ever lose something that made you feel whole? Jason hesitated. He had never lost anything that wasn't easily replaced. But now, as he sat in this place, stripped of his wealth and status, he was beginning to understand loss in a way he never had before. Not yet, he admitted, but I think I'm starting to understand what it means. Luis studied him for a long moment, then nodded. Good, because if you don't understand what you took from people, you'll never change. Jason swallowed hard, the weight of Luis's words settling in his chest. For the first time in his life, he didn't want to run from responsibility. He wanted to face it. A month had passed since Jason started his community service. The days were beginning to blend together, and with each passing hour, he was becoming less the arrogant, entitled billionaire's son and more someone who was finally beginning to see the world through others' eyes. But despite his growing sense of accountability, Jason knew he hadn't truly earned the forgiveness of the people around him, particularly the victims whose lives he had affected. He had done the work. He had shown up, but he hadn't yet made a real impact. That it wasn't until one fateful afternoon that Jason's understanding of his situation was truly tested. It was late in the day when Jason found himself in a room with a woman named Rachel. Rachel had been one of the victims of a reckless driving accident, and she had suffered life-altering injuries. She was confined to a wheelchair, much like Luis, and although she was recovering, her journey was filled with moments of doubt and anger. Jason had been asked to work with Rachel to help her get through some of her therapy exercises. But today, Rachel wasn't just going through the motions like usual. She was angry. "Why don't you just quit?" she snapped, glaring at Jason as he wheeled her into the therapy room. "I don't need your pity. Just go home and live your perfect life." Jason's heart sank. He had been getting used to the idea of taking responsibility, but this was different. "I'm not here to pity you," Jason replied, keeping his voice steady. "I'm here because I want to help." Rachel scoffed. "Help? You don't even know what it's like to lose everything, to have your whole life turned upside down by someone who thought they could do whatever they wanted." Jason's eyes dropped to the floor. For the first time, he realized that he couldn't fix Rachel's pain with a few kind words or gestures. "I get it," Jason said, his voice quieter now. "I've been selfish. I've been ignorant. But I'm trying to change. I'm trying to make it right." Rachel's eyes flickered with a hint of vulnerability. "You think you can change all the damage you've done by doing some community service?" Jason felt his chest tighten. He wanted to say something, anything, that would convince her he was sincere, that he wasn't just going through the motions for the sake of his own redemption. Instead, he simply nodded. "No, I can't change what's happened, but I can learn from it. And maybe, just maybe, I can help make things a little easier for people who are going through what I put them through." Rachel was silent for a long moment. She didn't look at him. Her eyes were focused on the floor. Finally, she sighed, her anger simmering down. "I don't believe you," she muttered, "but I'm willing to let you try." Jason's breath caught in his throat. "Thank you." As they began her therapy session, the two of them worked together in silence. Jason no longer saw Rachel as just a victim. He saw her as a person who had been hurt by his actions, just like many others. The path ahead was long, but Jason had never been more determined. Days turned into weeks, and Jason's journey of community service and self-reflection continued. The initial discomfort had started to fade, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. For the first time, he was investing his time, not for his own gain, but to truly make amends. But the real test of his transformation was yet to come. It was during a group therapy session when Jason's past caught up with him in a way he never expected. The room was filled with victims of car accidents. Some were recovering, others still struggling to find a way back to normalcy. Jason sat near the back, quietly listening to the conversations around him. The group leader, a woman named Carol, was facilitating a discussion about forgiveness. "You can't heal until you forgive," Carol said gently, looking around the room. "Not just the people who hurt you, but also yourself." Jason's heart skipped a beat. Forgiveness. It was something he had never truly considered for himself. How could he forgive himself for all the destruction his arrogance had caused? As the discussion continued, a man sitting across from Jason suddenly turned to him. "You're Jason Whitmore, right?" the man asked, his voice firm. Jason nodded, feeling the familiar weight of his last name hang in the air. "Yes." The man's eyes narrowed. "You're the one who caused the accident that left my sister in a wheelchair." Jason's breath caught in his throat. The room fell silent, and all eyes were on him. I didn't know," Jason stammered. "I didn't know your sister was—" "You didn't know?" the man interrupted, his voice rising. "You didn't know? You were speeding down the road like you owned it, not thinking about the people you might hurt." Jason's hands clenched into fists. This was it, the moment when he had to face the full weight of his actions, when the truth of what he had done would be laid bare in front of everyone. "I'm sorry," Jason said, his voice shaking. "I can't undo the harm I've caused, but I can promise you I'm doing everything I can to make things right. I'm trying to understand what it means to hurt people." The man stood up, his face twisted in anger. "I don't care about your promises. You think this community service is enough? You think that will make me forgive you?" Jason stood up too, facing the man with a newfound resolve. "No, it's not enough. I don't expect forgiveness just because I show up. But I can't hide anymore. I can't run from this." For a moment, there was silence. The man looked into Jason's eyes, searching for any sign of sincerity. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," the man finally said, his voice steady but filled with pain. "But at least you're here. At least you're trying." Jason swallowed hard, the weight of his guilt pressing down on him like never before. "That's all I can do," he whispered. As the session continued, Jason's heart was heavy. But he understood now. This wasn't about redemption through shortcuts or apologies. It was about the long, painful journey of truly understanding the consequences of his actions. It was about showing up, not just for others, but for himself. That night, as Jason lay in his bed, he thought about the people he had met at the rehabilitation center. He thought about the anger, the sorrow, the struggles that had shaped their lives, and how he had once been blind to all of it. But now, he saw it. He saw the ripple effect of his choices. He saw how his privilege had shielded him from reality for so long, and he was ready to face it all. It had been 2 months since Jason had started his community service, and every day he felt the weight of his actions more deeply. He no longer viewed his situation as a temporary punishment, but as the start of a new chapter in his life. Yet there was one final thing he needed to do before he could truly embrace his transformation. One final confrontation. Jason hadn't spoken to his father, Richard Whitmore, since the trial. Richard had been supportive of his son's legal defense, dismissing the consequences as a temporary setback for someone as influential as Jason. "You'll bounce back," Richard had told him repeatedly. "You're too valuable to be stuck in this mess." But Jason was no longer the man who craved his father's approval. It was time to confront Richard. It was time to show him the man Jason was becoming, not the spoiled, entitled son he had raised. That on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, Jason walked into the large, imposing Whitmore family estate. The mansion stood as a symbol of the wealth and power Richard had accumulated over the years. But to Jason, it felt like a prison. His father was sitting in the study, the same place where they had had countless conversations about business, success, and power. Richard looked up as Jason entered, his eyes narrowing. "Jason," Richard said, his voice cool but neutral. "I'm glad you could finally make it." Jason's chest tightened. This wasn't a casual visit. This wasn't the same son who had come to him for advice, hoping for approval. Jason had come here to challenge his father, to make him see the consequences of his arrogance and the destruction his wealth had enabled. "I've been working," Jason said simply. Richard raised an eyebrow. "Community service? Still trying to play the martyr, I see." Jason's jaw clenched, but he didn't respond. Instead, he walked toward the desk, sitting across from his father. The silence between them grew heavy. Finally, Richard spoke again. "So what is it you want? You want me to apologize for what happened? To fix everything for you?" Jason shook his head slowly. "No, Dad. I don't want you to fix anything. I've learned the hard way that no one can fix what I broke. Not you, not me, and certainly not the people I hurt." Richard's expression darkened. "You've become weak, Jason. You're throwing away everything we've worked for. You should be building your future, not playing at being a saint." Jason's voice grew stronger, the resolve clear in his eyes. "I don't want to build my future on the lies we've lived. I don't want to be the man you've tried to make me. I want to be someone who earns forgiveness, not through money or power, but through genuine change." Richard's eyes flashed with irritation. "This is foolishness, Jason. You're wasting your time. This world doesn't care about your little acts of charity. People respect power. People respect success. That's all that matters." Jason stood up, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Not anymore. I don't care about success if it means living a life without accountability. You've never understood what it means to hurt people, to make them feel powerless. But I get it now. I get it, and I'm not running from it." Richard sat back in his chair, his gaze filled with contempt. "You think you've learned something important? You think you've changed? You're still the same spoiled little rich boy who doesn't know what it means to struggle." Jason's heart hammered in his chest, but he didn't look away. "I'm not the same, Dad. I'm not. And I'll never be the person you want me to be. But I'm going to be someone I can be proud of. Someone who's willing to make amends, no matter how long it takes." The room was silent for a long moment. Richard stared at his son, as though trying to determine if Jason's words were genuine or a fleeting moment of weakness. Finally, Richard spoke, his voice quieter. "I don't know who you are anymore, Jason, but don't come to me asking for forgiveness. You're on your own now." Jason nodded, the words cutting deep, but he didn't flinch. "I'm okay with that." As Jason turned to leave, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. This was the moment he had feared, the moment he had dreaded. But it was also the moment of his true freedom. Jason knew he had broken away from the life his father had set out for him. He had become his own person, and he was ready to face whatever came next. As the door closed behind him, Jason's heart was heavy with the knowledge that his father's approval was no longer his goal. His journey had only just begun, but it was a journey he was prepared to continue on his own terms. It had been weeks since Jason had confronted his father, and the weight of that conversation lingered heavily in his mind. While he had feared rejection, he also understood that it was a necessary step in his transformation. For the first time, he felt the freedom that came with owning his mistakes and taking responsibility without relying on his family's name or wealth to shield him. But now, it was time for Jason to face the final and most challenging part of his journey: those who had suffered the consequences of his reckless actions. Jason had spent the last few months working on community service, but he had come to realize that service alone wouldn't heal the damage he had caused. He needed to face the individuals whose lives he had ruined with his arrogance, the people whose trust he had broken. This wasn't about checking off a box on a to-do list. It was about truly owning his past and trying to make up for it. The first person Jason reached out to was Sarah, the woman who had been paralyzed in the accident. He had visited her in the hospital after the crash, but at the time, he hadn't been able to see beyond his own world of entitlement. He had seen her as a victim, someone whose pain was a result of his actions, but he hadn't been able to truly see her as a person, someone whose life had been completely altered by a split-second decision that he sent her a message, unsure of what to expect. To his surprise, Sarah agreed to meet him at a small cafe in town. When Jason arrived, Sarah was already seated, her eyes cold and calculating as she watched him approach. Her wheelchair was parked at the corner of the table, the movement of her hands with her cane a silent reminder of how much her life had changed. Jason swallowed the lump in his throat as he sat down across from her. "Sarah, I don't know how to begin." Sarah looked at him, her gaze sharp but not unkind. "You don't have to say anything, Jason. I know why you're here." Jason nodded, feeling the weight of her words. He had no excuse for his actions, no justification. He had hurt her, and there was no undoing that. "I'm sorry," Jason said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "I can't change what I did, but I want you to know that I see you now. I see the woman you've become, not just the victim of my carelessness. I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't think I deserve forgiveness, but I want you to know that I'm trying to be better, to make amends where I can." Sarah's eyes softened, and for a moment, Jason thought she might speak, but instead, she just nodded. "I appreciate that. I really do. But you don't need to ask for forgiveness from me. You need to forgive yourself." Jason was taken aback by her words. "Forgive myself?" "Yes," she said firmly. "You can't keep punishing yourself for what happened. You've already paid a price. But redemption comes from how you move forward, not how you dwell on your past mistakes. Just don't forget to live in a way that makes you proud of who you are now, not who you were." Jason sat in silence, the weight of her words sinking deep into his heart. He had expected anger, resentment, and perhaps even hatred. Instead, he had found understanding and, strangely, peace. The next person Jason approached was the man who had confronted him in therapy, the one whose sister had been left in a wheelchair because of Jason's reckless driving. He had avoided contact with the man, unsure of how to face him after the heated exchange. But Jason knew that this was the moment of truth. This was where his journey of redemption would either succeed or fail. He arranged to meet the man at a small park where they could talk in private. Jason was early, pacing back and forth as he waited for him to arrive. When a man showed up, his eyes were as hard as they had been during the therapy session. "You still think this is about you?" the man asked as he approached, his voice full of skepticism. Jason took a deep breath, steeling himself for what he knew would be a difficult conversation. "No, this isn't about me. It's about making things right. I've hurt your sister, and I can never fix that, but I can promise you I'm doing everything I can to be a better person." The man shook his head, crossing his arms over his chest. "You think that makes it okay? That because you're sorry, it changes anything?" "No," Jason said, his voice steady. "It doesn't. But I've learned that the road to redemption isn't about making it okay. It's about making sure I never cause harm again. I've spent too much of my life ignoring the consequences of my actions, and I can't live like that anymore." For a long moment, the man didn't speak. He just stared at Jason, as though searching for any trace of the old arrogance. But when he spoke again, his voice was softer, though still tinged with anger. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Jason, but I'm glad you're doing this. Maybe you're changing. Maybe you're not the same person you were when all this started." Jason nodded, his heart heavy with the weight of his guilt. "I don't expect you to forgive me, but I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I just want you to know that I'm trying to make things right." As the conversation ended, Jason couldn't help but feel a sense of finality. He had done what he could to right his wrongs, and now it was up to others to decide what they would do with his attempts at redemption. The road ahead wasn't easy, but Jason was no longer afraid of facing the consequences of his actions. He had learned that redemption wasn't a quick fix. It wasn't a one-time apology. It was a lifelong commitment to being better, to seeing others not as obstacles to overcome, but as people whose lives were just as valuable as his own. And with that, Jason's transformation was complete.